I can't quite remember when I first began dreaming about Egypt. Maybe it was the first time I saw a picture of the Great Desert in an ancient history book, or one of those days when my mom, noticing my interest in all things historical, would let me pick what to watch on TV. I'd always choose documentaries about lost civilizations while other kids entertained themselves with toys and games. For them, the world was what lay before their eyes. For me, the allure was in uncovering the mysteries of the past. The pyramids, the tombs, and the Egyptian gods felt alive, watching me through the pages and the screens. The years went by, but that fascination only grew stronger. When I got to college, I chose to study archaeology, not due to any outside influence or practical motivation, but because it felt like a calling. Ancient Egypt seemed to pull me in like a mysterious magnet, something I could barely understand. It wasn't mere curiosity, it was an overwhelming desire to explore the unknown, to step onto the sands that had hidden secrets for thousands of years. With each class, I steered my career toward a clear goal, uncovering the mysteries that lay buried in Egypt's desert. For more than a decade, my life was dedicated to archaeology. I worked on excavations across the United States and Central America, uncovering millennia-old cultures and gaining a deeper understanding of our own history. Every dig, every artifact, every fragment found was a piece of the human puzzle. But Egypt remained a separate dream, an almost unreachable goal, like a distant beacon calling me from thousands of miles away. I felt an unexplainable connection to that land, and in my studies, I always sought out clues that could eventually lead me there. One rainy night in Seattle, my life took an unexpected turn. I was poring over documents in a small library, lost in a seemingly insignificant research project, when I found a forgotten, dust-covered volume marked by the passage of time. Its title, nearly faded, intrigued me. But what caught my eye was the author's name, Dr. Osman Abu al-Futu. I immediately remembered an article I'd read about him. Dr. Osman was an Egyptian professor and Egyptologist who had conducted groundbreaking research in the 1970s, but had mysteriously disappeared during one of his expeditions. Few knew what had really happened to him, and conspiracy theories surrounded his name. In my academic circle, he was something of a legend, a man who claimed to have found clues about a forgotten city of the dead, a place that, according to him, held secrets never before revealed. I held the book as if it were a priceless artifact. As I flipped through it, I realized it was a diary filled with fragmented notes and pages scrawled with inscriptions I could barely make out. Most of the notes were in Arabic, but some sections, written hurriedly in English, were more jumbled. With each page, new glimpses of Dr. Osman's beliefs and discoveries emerged. The narrative was disjointed, as if he were describing a series of terrifying visions. The name City of the Dead appeared often, and his descriptions were almost supernatural. A dark place sealed beneath the Egyptian desert, guarded by unknown forces. As I read, a sense of dread mixed with excitement. On the following pages, Dr. Osman mentioned a hidden portal that, according to him, connected the world of the living to the world of the dead. For someone like me, a skeptic who approached archaeology with purely scientific eyes, that description sounded implausible, even absurd, but there was something in his tone, a frightening conviction, that made me question my own disbelief. When I finished reading, I was both captivated and disturbed. Dr. Osman's words had planted something inside me, a seed of doubt, an insatiable urge to find this so-called city of the dead. His final notes were a plea for no one to continue his quest, but I couldn't get it out of my head. Days passed, and I grew obsessed with the manuscript, imagining how someone could hide something so monumental under Egypt's sands. I knew I had to go. Logic and science told me that the man had probably lost his mind, or worse, fabricated a hoax that fueled the myths surrounding him. But something deep within told me otherwise. I wouldn't have peace until I saw with my own eyes what he described. What if there was even a slim chance of discovering a lost city? What if, indeed, there were secrets buried there, waiting to be revealed? With a thrill bordering on madness, I booked my flight. My destination, Egypt, specifically the outskirts of the Giza Plateau. I didn't know what I would find, or if I would find anything at all, but I felt ready to face any danger, anything that ancient land had in store for me. Growing up in Montana, surrounded by mountains and forests, was incomparable to the vast Sahara Desert or the ancient Egyptian pyramids. Perhaps it was this distance, this extreme contrast, that made Egypt seem so otherworldly to me. I was born and raised in a simple family, where archaeology was a distant, almost utopian idea. My parents, both teachers, were the first to notice my fascination with ancient civilizations. They would say that unlike other boys who collected marbles and trading cards, I spent hours studying ancient cultures in the books from our neighborhood library. Over time, that childhood curiosity became an obsession. As I grew older, I devoured books on archaeology and history, exploring every detail of the world's great ancient civilizations. I think I was driven in part by the desire to understand how these civilizations shaped the modern world. But more than that, I wanted to discover something that hadn't yet been revealed. Egypt was, above all, my ultimate goal, a place brimming with mysteries, enigmas, and a spirituality that seemed to transcend time. So, with the manuscript packed carefully in my bag and an unquiet heart, I set off for Egypt. I was about to face the greatest mystery of my life, a secret buried beneath the desert sands that could change me forever, or consume my very sanity. Landing in Cairo felt like stepping into another dimension. As I disembarked from the plane, I was instantly enveloped by the arid, stifling heat, the scent of spices in the air, and a chaotic mix of voices in different languages. Around me, ancient and modern Egyptian culture seemed to coexist in vibrant harmony. I was so close to realizing a long-held dream that I felt a strange restlessness, as if destiny awaited me just beyond the bustling streets and bazaars of Cairo. The taxi wound its way through a labyrinth of narrow streets, illuminated by the setting sun that cast the city in shades of gold and orange. There was something in the air that pulsed like an invisible energy. I felt like a small part of a much larger tapestry, something that stretched beyond my comprehension. When we finally reached the hotel, I sensed that this place held a living history, dark and enigmatic, as if guarding secrets no one dared to uncover. In the hotel lobby, I was met by a man observing me with a curious and guarded expression. This was Ibrahim, my guide. He was a man of few words, with piercing eyes and a solemn, almost foreboding demeanor. I had hired him on the recommendation of a colleague, who mentioned that Ibrahim knew the legends and ancient stories of Egypt, and more importantly, was aware of the hidden sites that few archaeologists dared to explore. He was reserved, but I got the impression he knew far more than he let on. After a brief greeting, Ibrahim led me to a private room in the hotel where someone else awaited us. She introduced herself as Leila Osman, and I immediately recognized the connection. The last name was the same as Dr. Osman. She was a young Egyptologist, the granddaughter of Dr. Osman himself, and she revealed that she too was seeking answers about what had happened to her grandfather. Leila's expression was determined, but a shadow of sadness lingered in her eyes. The kind of pain only someone who has lost a loved one under mysterious circumstances could understand.
I heard you found my grandfather's manuscript.
She began, looking directly at me with intensity.
That manuscript, those words, they're all we have left of him. And I need to understand what really happened.
Leila told me how she grew up hearing stories of her grandfather, a man of great intelligence and courage who had dedicated his life to archaeology until his final days. Her family had few keepsakes of him aside from an old trunk filled with notes and aged photographs. But his disappearance haunted her, especially because of the legends surrounding his 1970 expedition and the mystery of the City of the Dead. She paused, and Ibrahim seized the silence to step closer.
You understand that this is no ordinary search. The City of the Dead is not a place for the living. Many believe it's guarded by the gods or by something far older and darker.
There was a moment of tension in the air. However, Leila was just as determined as I was to continue our investigation, despite the warnings. She knew that her grandfather's manuscript mentioned the Great Pyramid as a starting point, a place where he claimed to have discovered the entrance to the unknown. We decided that our first stop would be there, in the heart of the Giza complex. At dawn, we set off, passing through the city's streets, still half asleep. Anticipation was etched on each of our faces, though fear was also evident. Leila studied an old map her grandfather had drawn, which mentioned a secret tunnel beneath the pyramid, a passageway he believed connected the earthly realm to what he called the land of the forgotten. As the sun rose over the horizon, revealing the vast Giza plateau, I was overcome by a mixture of awe and fear. The pyramids loomed before us, as imposing and challenging as I had imagined. I knew that behind each stone lay a story, a secret, but above all, those pyramids seemed to guard something ancient, something pulsing in the shadows. Ibrahim, ever serious, walked alongside us with a grim expression. Just before we entered the pyramid, he whispered,
They say this place was never meant for men. The City of the Dead is closer to us than we imagine, and those who dare to enter may never return.
The warning sent a shiver down my spine, but Leila and I pressed on. The entrance was closed off to the public, guarded by a massive stone door that Ibrahim opened skillfully. We entered, and darkness enveloped us. We switched on our flashlights, but the dense blackness of the tunnel seemed to swallow the light. As we advanced, I noticed the tunnels sprawling like veins within an ancient, massive body. The silence was absolute, broken only by the echo of our footsteps and the occasional scraping of sand shifting around us. The walls were covered in hieroglyphs, some familiar but others different. They seemed to tell forgotten stories, a language belonging to a time beyond time. As we ventured deeper, Leila began translating the hieroglyphs softly, murmuring phrases about eternity and the cycle of life and death. The further we went, the more detailed and ominous the inscriptions became, speaking of a final door connecting the world of the living to that of the dead. Then a particular inscription caught our attention. It was carved on a lone stone, almost like a final warning. Leila murmured as she read,
He who dares go beyond this point will see what was not meant for the eyes of the living. The City of the Dead holds secrets of the past and the future. May the gods have mercy on your soul.
I stood in silence, feeling the weight of those words. I looked to Ibrahim, who gave a slight nod, indicating that I could still turn back. But the mystery was calling me like a magnet. Finally, we reached a carved stone door, so massive it was hard to imagine how the ancient Egyptians could have moved it. Ibrahim and I pushed the door, and it opened with a deep groan, revealing a vast hall illuminated by an eerie light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if made of some kind of phosphorescent mineral. The chamber felt suspended in time. Inside, more inscriptions covered the walls, and at the center stood a pedestal bearing an object cloaked in dust, a relic that seemed to radiate a strange energy, drawing us in and repelling us at the same time. Leila slowly approached the pedestal and wiped the dust from the artifact. It was a golden amulet bearing an ancient symbol I had never seen before, though something told me it was a key. As I held the amulet, a wave of energy surged through me, as though the amulet were alive, pulsing with a mysterious force. Suddenly the air grew heavier. A faint murmur began to echo in the chamber, an almost imperceptible sound that grew clearer by the second. It was an ancient voice, speaking words in a dialect I couldn't understand, but its presence was unmistakable. Leila gripped my hand, her eyes wide with terror and fascination. Ibrahim stepped back, crossing his arms and muttering prayers, his face pale in the dim light. The voice, coming from a place beyond time, murmured in an increasingly audible tone. Leila tried to translate, her lips trembling.
Those who seek the dead will find a fate worse than death.
I looked at the amulet in my hands, and suddenly it seemed to come alive, as if a force were guiding us. We felt an almost suffocating presence in the chamber, an invisible entity watching our every move, as if deciding whether we were worthy to continue. In silence, we exchanged a look of determination. We were about to cross a point of no return, and while fear consumed us, curiosity drove us forward. After all, we were driven by the same desire, to uncover the secrets of the past, no matter the cost. The darkness inside the pyramid seemed to grow thicker with every step we took. The flashlight in my hand felt almost useless against the solid darkness enveloping us. The air was heavy with an invisible presence, something none of us dared mention aloud, but that all of us felt. It was as if the shadows around us had a life of their own, watching as we ventured further into the tunnel. As we descended deeper, I started to notice changes in the walls. The familiar hieroglyphs gave way to more complex, ancient symbols, something I had never seen in any of my research. Leila walked ahead, her flashlight illuminating the intricate carvings. She stopped at a specific point where the symbol of Anubis, the god of the dead, was carved into a darker, more worn stone.
He's in a judgment pose. This isn't common. It seems ceremonial, something reserved for rites of passage.
Her observation sent a chill through me. I knew we were approaching something significant, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that permeated the air. Behind us, Ibrahim appeared even more tense. He muttered prayers in Arabic, his voice muffled and trembling, as if those words were the only thing keeping him grounded. Farther down, Leila found another inscription, this one even more unsettling. In clear but different script from traditional hieroglyphs, a phrase was engraved with almost artistic care. She read it slowly, her voice faltering with each word.
Gate of Shadows. Passage from the realm of the living to the domain of the dead.
Her voice faded into the silence of the chamber, but the phrase echoed in my mind. The idea that we were near a gate to the domain of the dead filled me with an almost uncontrollable sense of fear and fascination. This wasn't ordinary archaeology. We were crossing the boundaries of reality in a way I had never experienced. We pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last until we reached a larger chamber. As we entered, the air grew dense, almost unbreathable, and I realized that the darkness here was even more intense. The silence had changed too. It was no longer just an absence of sound, but an oppressive quiet that seemed to have its own voice, muffling any noise we tried to make. In the center of the chamber, an immense statue of Osiris awaited us. His face turned downward, but his sculpted eyes seemed to follow our every move. Osiris, god of the afterlife, resurrection, and judgment, appeared to be the guardian of this hidden chamber. Seeing his figure there, shrouded in shadow, was unnerving, as if he were observing us not as intruders, but as souls he was about to judge. I watched as Leila slowly approached, fascinated, then her eyes widened at something I hadn't noticed. Behind the statue of Osiris, more inscriptions covered the wall, written in even older letters with carvings that looked freshly uncovered.
It's a warning,
she murmured, her voice tinged with sudden fear.
It says only those who who accept their fate can cross.
At that moment, an invisible pressure seemed to push us back. It was as though some intangible force was testing us, probing our resolve. We felt the weight of every word, every symbol, and the chamber felt increasingly like a divine tribunal, where each of our thoughts was laid bare for judgment. As Leila read the inscription, I spotted something unusual on the ground, a small, dust-covered relic. I bent down to pick it up, and as I stood, I realized it was a small amulet made of a dark, heavy metal, with the same Gate of Shadows symbol etched on its surface. As I held it, a cold wave coursed through me, like death itself had touched my skin.
That
Ibrahim whispered, his eyes fixed on the amulet in my hand.
is a sign. Something is watching us. We shouldn't have come.
The tension in his voice was palpable, but Leila and I were entranced by what we were seeing. The amulet seemed to pulse, as if it had its own energy, and I knew it was the key to whatever lay ahead. We moved toward another, smaller door almost hidden in the shadows, and Leila examined it carefully. It was a massive stone door, covered in intricate symbols, reminiscent of ancient sacred texts, but with a supernatural quality that felt alive, as if the gods themselves were watching and weighing our intentions. As I touched the door, I felt a faint vibration under my hand. This wasn't just rock. It was as if the stone was recognizing our presence, absorbing our energy. Then, with a deep, resonant sound, the door began to move, slowly opening as if allowing us passage for some unknown reason. On the other side, we found a room cloaked in shadows, illuminated by a strange, muted light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The room was empty, but the air was thicker, almost suffocating, laden with an oppressive presence that seemed to seep into our minds.
They're watching us,
Leila whispered, her eyes fixed on something visible only to her. At that moment, a figure began to take shape in the darkness. It was an indistinct form, sculpted from shadows and light, something the eyes could barely capture but the heart could feel. I knew it was one of the gods, a presence not of our world but manifesting there, in the half-light, as living proof of the myths and legends we had studied all our lives. The figure seemed to look directly at me, its eyes dark voids of infinite depth, and I felt as if my very soul were being judged, each of my thoughts exposed and examined. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, but I couldn't look away. It was as if something held me there, forcing me to confront the unknown. Beside me, I heard Ibrahim's muffled whisper, his prayers growing louder and more urgent. He was terrified but didn't dare flee. Leila, however, stood motionless, mesmerized by the supernatural presence before us. The figure gestured toward the opposite wall, where a new inscription had appeared, as if written in that very moment. The words were clear and chilling. Those who cross the gate of shadows renounce the world of the living. Only those who accept the truth may proceed. The phrase hit us like a blow. Leila and I exchanged a glance, both aware that we were on the brink of something far greater than we had imagined. Ibrahim seemed torn between fear and the urge to escape, but we knew we couldn't turn back now. The god's presence felt like a test, a trial, and we wouldn't be worthy to continue without facing it. With my heart pounding like a drum, I approached the inscription, touching it with my fingertips. Instantly, the chamber began to vibrate, and the figure before us dissolved as if its judgment had been rendered. Before us, a passage opened. As we crossed the threshold of the newly opened passage, an even deeper and denser darkness enveloped us, swallowing any trace of light we tried to hold on to. The air felt colder, and there was a strange metallic smell, as though the very space around us was rotting and corroded with age. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, but there was nowhere to escape. We had come too far, and turning back felt as impossible as crossing the desert without provisions. The tunnel before us twisted and narrowed, the walls covered with symbols that seemed to claw their way out of the stone, almost coming alive in the shadows cast by our flashlights. It was a labyrinth. Each turn brought a new dilemma, each fork an agonizing choice. Leila strained to interpret the inscriptions, but they were unlike those in the previous corridors. Here, the symbols weren't warnings or tales of glory. They were visions of eternal suffering. Creatures with animal heads and cruel eyes were depicted holding imprisoned souls, some of which were shown screaming in anguish, etched with horrific clarity. At one point, Leila stopped, her eyes wide as she stared at an inscription depicting Anubis himself, the god of death and guardian of the gates to the afterlife. He was shown in a judging pose, but unlike conventional portrayals where Anubis guides souls, here he seemed to be holding them captive with an oppressive grip, his claws digging into his prey.
I've never seen Anubis represented like this. It's as if he's waiting.
The maze seemed to lead us in circles, each corridor identical to the last, trapping us in an unending nightmare. But we knew something awaited us. Ibrahim, who had been silent up until now, began muttering his prayers louder, as if they were his only defense against the growing terror. "We're being watched," I whispered, feeling a chill run down my spine. "I can feel it. They're here." After countless attempts to find the way, we reached a wider corridor, and there, at the end, we saw a shadow move. It was a tall, slender figure, yet with a presence so powerful it felt almost like a living statue. When the flashlight illuminated its face, I knew instantly who it was: Anubis, the god of the dead. He stood before us, his powerful form and jackal's head looming over us, his hollow eyes glowing with an energy that seemed to pulse with the very shadows around him. My entire body froze. Every instinct screamed for me to run. But Anubis's presence held us in place, as though he had ensnared our souls in an invisible web. Leila attempted to whisper something in Arabic, a prayer perhaps, or a plea, but her words faltered, mingling with the oppressive silence. Anubis then extended a hand, and I saw he was holding a scale, an ancient symbol of judgment. He raised it, and with a slow, imposing gesture, he began to weigh our intentions, our fears, everything we were. I felt exposed, as though each memory, each secret, was laid bare before him. At some point, without our noticing, the labyrinth around us began to shift. The ground vanished beneath our feet, and suddenly we found ourselves floating in a vast, dark expanse with only Anubis before us. He looked deep into us, his penetrating eyes seeming to reach the core of our souls, and in a whisper that seemed to vibrate in the very air around us, Anubis spoke.
"You seek what is not meant for the living. Are you prepared to cross the gate of death?"
I was breathless. The weight of his words hit me like an anchor as he extended the scale, as though awaiting our answer. I glanced at Leila and Ibrahim, who were both in utter shock, but I knew there was no turning back. Leila stepped forward, trembling but resolute.
"We are ready."
She murmured with a determination that in that moment seemed to come from somewhere beyond our world. Anubis studied us for a long moment before nodding. He then lifted the scale once more, and the vision around us darkened. The last thing I saw was the fire-like glow in Anubis's eyes before we were consumed by total darkness. The void swallowed us, and for a moment I felt as though I were floating in an infinite abyss. The world around me had disappeared. No walls, no floor, no sense of limit. It was as if I were suspended in space itself, with no time or direction. A freezing chill invaded my bones, and I felt as though each memory, every piece of who I was being drawn out and examined. Gradually, the shadows began to fade, revealing what seemed like a narrow, winding passage illuminated by a dim, spectral light. The stone floor was rough, covered in sand and scored with deep marks, as though something had scratched its surface over the centuries. Ibrahim stood beside me, breathing heavily, and Leila steadied herself against the wall, trying to regain her balance. "Where are we?" I whispered, but none of us had an answer. The corridor opened into a circular chamber. The walls were covered in paintings that seemed to come alive in the dim light. The scenes depicted souls wandering through a desert, guided by Anubis, while other figures, ancient gods with animal heads, watched, judging and deciding their fates. Leila approached one of the walls, studying the intricate inscriptions with a mixture of fascination and fear.
These are depictions of the judgment of the dead. This chamber, it's like a bridge between the living and the dead, a place where souls are tested.
A rising terror gripped me. Those paintings weren't mere artistic representations. They pulsed, vibrating with a disturbing energy, as if they were memories trapped in the stones, waiting to emerge. In the center of the chamber lay a massive sarcophagus, covered in complex symbols I could barely comprehend. I felt that this place held something ancient and powerful, something that should never be disturbed.
This sarcophagus, it's a gate. The ancient gods used it as a passage, a crossing point between our world and theirs.
Ibrahim approached, hesitant, and muttered.
"We're treading on the gods' territory. They can feel us here."
Then, as if the very air had solidified, we heard heavy footsteps echoing through the chamber. I looked to the far end of the room, where shadows began to move, rearranging themselves until they formed a figure, the imposing figure of Anubis. He was not merely a sculpted image or a carved symbol. Standing before us, the god of death was present in flesh, with his jackal's head and fiery, piercing eyes. Anubis seemed to evaluate our every move, every beat of our hearts. The scale reappeared in his hands, and I knew at that moment that we were being judged. It was a judgment of intentions, hidden desires, perhaps even every secret we carried. Anubis regarded us not merely as visitors to his domain, but as intruders, souls who had dared to cross to the other side.
"You seek the city of the dead,"
he declared, his voice reverberating through the space, filling every corner of the chamber.
"But there is a price."
I swallowed, unsure how to respond. Leila, however, stepped forward with a resolve that surprised me. She met Anubis's gaze and she whispered,
We seek the truth about my grandfather, Dr. Osman. We want to understand what he saw, what he discovered.
Anubis tilted his head, studying her like a predator assessing its prey. Then, to my astonishment, he smiled, a cold, inhuman smile. He raised a hand and the chamber around us began to tremble. The ground seemed to melt beneath our feet, as though we were being swallowed by a vortex of shadows.
Truth is a burden. Those who seek truth must be prepared to bear its weight.
With an imperious gesture, Anubis placed his hand over the sarcophagus. The object, which had seemed immovable, began to emit a pale, unsettling light, and its lid slowly shifted. When the sarcophagus finally opened, a narrow, winding staircase was revealed beneath, descending into even deeper darkness.
The city of the dead lies ahead.
Anubis murmured, his voice softer but still as sharp as steel.
Only those who accept the judgment may cross.
With one last look, he stepped back, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there. Silence returned to the chamber, but the weight of his presence lingered over us. I looked at Leila and Ibrahim, and I could see that they were as terrified as I was, but a fierce determination bound us together. We descended the narrow staircase, knowing that each step took us deeper into the unknown, into a city that existed between the worlds of the living and the dead, a realm where the laws of our world no longer applied. And yet we were ready, or at least we wanted to believe we were. The air grew denser and thinner as we descended the steps of the staircase revealed by Anubis. Each step seemed to pull us further from reality, thrusting us into a realm beyond human comprehension. There was no turning back. We were committed, and the fear we felt was matched by a morbid fascination, a curiosity that drew us deeper, even as every instinct urged us to retreat. At the bottom of the staircase, the absolute darkness gradually dissipated, revealing a vast hall illuminated by an unnatural light. The glow did not seem to come from torches or candles, but instead radiated directly from the walls, as though the space itself was infused with energy. The room was grand, yet an oppressive weight hung over it. Enormous statues of Egyptian gods, as tall as the walls, lined each side, their expressions rigid and cold, watching over us as guardians of an impending judgment. Their shadows stretched around us, forming a circle in which we were confined. Each statue represented a deity I recognized from ancient texts: Thoth, the divine scribe; Horus, the falcon god; Maat, the goddess of justice, and other divine figures whose inert gazes bore an authority that surpassed any earthly court. The sensation that our every step was being observed overtook me. I knew these statues were more than mere representations. Each one seemed to contain a living presence, an essence that embodied something immortal and terrifying. The walls of the room were covered in hieroglyphs narrating rituals of judgment and journeys into the underworld, tales of souls crossing the threshold between life and death, confronting their sins and their darkest truths. In the center of the room stood a stone platform intricately carved, resembling an altar. Upon it rested a set of scales, adorned with golden inscriptions, glowing with a disturbing light. I knew exactly what those scales represented: the scales of judgment, where souls were weighed against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and justice. My heart raced. If we stood before those scales, it meant we were about to be judged. Leila and Ibrahim stood beside me, each in total silence, trying to process what was happening. Leila gazed at the scales with a mixture of awe and terror, her lips moving in silent prayers, while Ibrahim seemed paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the deities surrounding us. A low sound, a deep hissing whisper, began to fill the air. I couldn't pinpoint its source. It seemed to come from all directions at once, reverberating off the walls like a wave. Suddenly, Anubis reappeared, emerging from the shadows. He moved toward us with an air of authority and severity that made the air around us tremble. With a gesture, Anubis signaled for us to approach the scales. I felt an invisible pressure pushing me forward, as though some force beyond my control was compelling me to obey. As we neared the scales, Anubis positioned himself behind them, looking at us with those dark, deep eyes that seemed to pierce beyond flesh and mind, seeing directly into our souls.
You have entered the domain of the dead.
He declared, his voice a blend of thunder and whisper.
To proceed, you must prove yourselves worthy. Each of you shall be weighed. Each of you will face your truth.
When he finished speaking, he turned his gaze on me, and I felt the weight of his stare, as if each mistake, each doubt, was being brought to the surface. A deadly chill spread through my chest as Anubis extended a hand toward me, indicating that I should step onto the stone platform. My mind swayed between terror and curiosity, but there was no way to escape. As I stepped onto the platform, a strange sensation took hold of my body. I felt as though time had stopped. The environment around me blurred, leaving only me and Anubis face to face. He raised a hand, and with a simple gesture, a golden feather appeared before him, hovering in the air as though made of pure light. He placed the feather of Maat on one side of the scale. On the opposite side, I felt an invisible weight form, and I understood that it was my very soul. The scales began to move, the pans swaying slightly as I felt a rising tension, as though my entire life was being scrutinized, every thought, every hidden desire, every action. Visions began to materialize around me, scenes from my childhood, my failures, my fears, all of it was there, exposed like a theater piece staged for an audience of gods. I saw my obsession with Egypt, the veiled ambition to discover something extraordinary for my own glory, the moments of despair when I sacrificed friendships and love for the obsession to uncover secrets. Each choice seemed to add weight to the scales, each doubt tipping the balance. Then something shifted. The atmosphere around me began to stir, and I heard distant screams, laments that seemed to come from souls in eternal suffering. It was as though my own hesitation was being judged. The pan holding my soul began to dip lower, growing heavier. My heart sank as I saw that my side of the scales was starting to outweigh the feather of Maat. Anubis observed me, implacable and unmoved. Then his voice echoed again.
Your soul is heavy, mortal. Doubt remains in you, selfishness lingers. Why do you seek the city of the dead?
I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words, and knew I couldn't lie. With an effort that drained me completely, I answered, I seek the truth, but I also seek answers that belong to me, and perhaps redemption. Anubis inclined his head as though considering my response. The scales stopped moving, the weight stabilized, and I felt a weakness take over my body, yet I was still standing. He then turned to Leila. She, who had remained silent throughout the judgment, walked to the platform with a dignity that surprised me. Her eyes shone, not with fear, but with determination. When she stepped up, the images around us changed, showing moments from her life. A childhood marked by her grandfather's disappearance, the weight of carrying a legacy she barely understood. But there was something else, a deep faith, a desire to understand what her grandfather had discovered as a final tribute to him. The scales swayed, but not as much as they had for me. It was as though Leila had been approved before she even stepped onto the platform. Anubis regarded her with what seemed almost like respect, and with a gesture indicated that she was free to proceed. Finally, he turned to Ibrahim, who was trembling so violently it seemed his legs might give way beneath him. When he stepped onto the platform, the atmosphere shifted once more. Visions of Ibrahim's deepest fears materialized, images of death, loss, the terror of never achieving salvation. The scales rocked violently, and Ibrahim's side sank lower and lower, as though he bore the weight of 1,000 fears and sins. The entire room grew tense, and we all held our breath. Anubis looked at him with a dark gaze, as if awaiting a final confession. In a desperate act, Ibrahim fell to his knees, muttering prayers and begging for forgiveness. It was evident that he feared the judgment more than any of us, and his words emerged as trembling sobs. Anubis, impassive, raised his hand, and with a definitive gesture, the scales steadied, but not as they had before. Instead of leaving him standing, the god of the dead sentenced him to the ground. A deadly chill filled the room, and Ibrahim collapsed unconscious, the weight of the judgment too much for him to bear. At last, Anubis looked at us, knowing we had passed the judgment, but not without cost. His final words echoed like a decree.
The city of the dead will open to you, but remember, you cannot escape your own souls. The judgment never ends.
With one last gesture, he dissolved into the shadows, and a new portal opened before us, revealing the entrance to the city of the dead, to be continued.